All right, so Myra Schechtman here. I wanted to say something about her just before we move on. Okay, so she's older than me, born in 1960 and such. And she's a philosophy professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and also what is the Laboratory of Integrated Neuroscience that she's in. Now, she didn't start out in her undergraduate degree of philosophy. In a sense, she couldn't decide. So it wasn't that she couldn't decide, I'll do philosophy. She couldn't decide because too many things interested her. And she knew she couldn't study them all, and then it dawned on her, I guess, through taking a philosophy course, that's about as close as you can get. Philosophy dangles and everything. So she kind of got into it in the back row for that, and then by the time she got into graduate school, she was part of a reading group, and she read Derek Parfit, who we just spoke about. And if you rolled your eyes a little bit, so did she. She said that doesn't quite sit right with me, and thought that perhaps she would spend some time trying to disprove, or at least show some of the errors in what he's done. And then, to be honest, she thought it was wacky. But she eventually got to the conclusion that this is a little more intelligent than she thought, and certainly harder to disprove than she thought. Now, she was approaching it at the same angle. There's other ways that you can, not dismiss, that you could almost undo some of his problems. But if you're going to take him on his own game, yeah, it got a little more difficult. So that's kind of how she got into the whole thing. But it set it off on her own, what did say, discovery of personal identity and exactly, what that entails. Now, I think these personal, well, let me see if there's anything really worth saying. We could move on from this. Yeah, let's just go on. All right. Some of what she really was curious about, and these are the questions that she had, and maybe you came up with these too, and to a certain degree, they seem like they'd be reasonable questions. In other words, Locke tied personal identity to memory, so for him, consciousness was memory. She thought, I think he's overemphasized that, because I don't know about you, but there are things that I remember that don't necessarily, I don't think they're that central to my personal identity, and there's probably things that I forget. We're going to talk more about that. But she also didn't think that he was off. I mean, I think you and I would admit, too, that our memory has some connection and continuity with who we are in our personal identity. But it's not everything, right? So she's not dismissing Parfit outright. And she's also not just, getting rid of what Parfit tried to build off of Locke, but still she's saying there's something there, but I think he's overemphasizing something, and she's going to try to whittle it down a little bit to see exactly where it goes. Because the other thing, too, and we'll talk more about this shortly, is that there are also those things that we don't remember that we have to ask ourselves, how do they affect who we are as individuals? So the unconscious, right? There's things on both sides of this fence that perhaps are all experiences, right? Whether we remember it or not, it's an experience. So now we're just trying to say, in what way do we relate to this previous experience? On one level, we may not remember it. And maybe it does have some, major influence. And I'll share some stories with you. And then on the other hand, maybe we do remember, and it's not something very central. Now, what do you think about that just as a critique overall? If somebody were just to tell you that, okay, let's say somebody comes up to you and you're just talking, and they say, well, memories are important for our identity, right? And yeah, okay. Well, are there things that you remember that don't seem central? Are there things that you forget that maybe they're important? What would you say to that person if you were just having a discussion? You don't have to worry about trying to sound academic or anything. Yes?
I feel like if they were important, you would sort of remember it more because it would be central to what you consider yourself or how you take your morals into use.
Okay, importance. What else? Anybody?
I feel like maybe even if you don't remember it now, if it helped shape who you were when you were way younger or something, then I guess the memory of it doesn't matter, but just the effect of it will matter.
That's a good point too. And again, we're going to go over this. I like that. So on what you're saying, you may not have the memory, but you'll have the effect of the memory.
It mattered then, and you would remember it I don't know, 4 months after. But if you're way down in your life and you don't remember it, but it still had the same effect because it changed you then. And,
yeah.
It doesn't matter.
maybe like it's a very simplistic scenario, but maybe you got so accustomed to driving home one way because there's always traffic while they were doing construction, and after a while you almost forgot, why am I going? Oh, that's right, because I was avoiding there's things like that. I like to think too, it's important, and there's always it's always like a sad irony when there's an irony, it's sad when something tragic happens near a particular holiday. It's very hard for us to, mentally disconnect that memory from that holiday. So, Christmas is always a difficult time for a lot of people who may have lost somebody. Like I have not in-laws, I have cousins who lost, their father passed away at Christmas Eve. Well, it's hard to, disengage that from your mind and such, right? That type of thing. So I think, right off the bat, and this would be like my critiques originally of some of this is, what are we talking about in memories? They're not all equal. I mean, some memories are more essential and other ones aren't. So what am I remembering, what am I not remembering? And, we can talk about a lot, like anybody that studies psychoanalysis and such, they'll even talk about the traumatic effects of birth. No, none of us remember that, right? But the reality is, they'll say, well, it's still that effect that has, left on us and such. So anyway, I think it was kind of interesting that she got into philosophy because she couldn't really settle her mind. And so many things seemed of interest because philosophy is that one encompassing thing. It's like you name it, it falls under it. I think psychology's close, but nonetheless. All right, so this is going to be her idea. She's going to talk about characterization and exactly what that means. So even if memories aren't everything, fine, but they're still very crucial. And I think we would say that, we'd have to work out like exactly maybe well, I'm interested. Like this is just thought, thinking out loud. What would you say then are the importance of the memories for an individual who, say, is in a vegetative state or somebody who has dementia? Can memory still be essential in that regard? I have somebody just about my age that has vascular dementia. It's kind of sad and scary for the family, right? We start to use terms like, well, that's not them anymore. We know it's the human person, but, I don't know. I mean, if you're not quite sure, I don't know what the answer to that is either. If a person loses a particular memories. So maybe that's one of the issues. Like, like if we're going to, you always have to tie this into ethics somehow. What would be our ethics in end-of-life care to people who perhaps have, say, vascular dementia, and they no longer have the memories? If you tied memories into the core part of an identity, then who is this person? Maybe you'd almost have to either like pull some web of sympathy, almost like, well, but the thing that they have extends to them, so it's the previous self that's still, apparently something there. Maybe, who knows, right? And who knows what we'll find out about the mind. It's very difficult for us to tell. You've all heard stories, and they're rare, about people who are in, some sort of coma and heard every blessed thing around them. I don't know, I was just reading one about a month or so ago. I think it was a younger mother, and she literally heard the conversations over organ donation. And absolutely in a comatose state, she couldn't respond, had no way to even signify that here she is. And I'm not quite sure what pulled her out. I've read stories about somebody in a coma for 19 years and out they come. Now those are extraordinary, right? So a lot of people, for the most part, do not come out of those things. But it makes us wonder, where is it? Maybe we can make an argument that there's still a residency of the memory, and somehow that counts, even if it's not something that the person is conscious of. Maybe we can make an argument that we have memories that we're not conscious of that still form who we are. So they have memories that are conscious, and that's still there. But these are the issues. Like if you take bioethics or anything else, these are the things that you have to try to grasp at. We're making a lot of decisions on things that we don't always know. And you hate to say stay on the side of caution, but you almost have to, because without certainty, it would be like the equivalent of saying, we're going to implode this building to make way for a parking lot. Is there anybody in there? Well, we're not entirely sure. Then you don't implode the building. you need to check that first. So just things to think about, as we move through here. I often think too, I'm trying to think of like things that may have created habitual rituals in our lives that we no longer attach any sort of cause to. We don't even know like why we're doing that anymore. We'll talk more about that. Okay, so again, I'm not giving you the blow-by-blow on her, and you weren't even to read the entire Experience, Agency, and Personal Identity article. But I'm just trying to give you the flavor of it. So the self is almost like a narrative. Now, narratives are very important for us, right? In other words, in many ways, there are stories. We even talk in those terms. And in other ways, too, they can be rather subjective. That's the one thing I think we have to kind of like keep in the back of our heads. So if we can create our own narratives, and if it's a collection of our experiences and agency and everything else, and our identity's tied to that, then you could change and transfer and do all kinds of things with your identity. So we're kind of back to struggling, like somebody who's more Aristotelian or would right away say, well, what's the essential beyond underneath all of this? What you're going to see is a lot of these thinkers don't find anything essential underneath that. They're talking everything more in terms of a continuity, that there's something there that connects it, even if we don't quite know what it is. So what she's going to work out is it's a sense of this narrative and these experiences that have formed us. Now, it's hard for us to deny that we're not shaped by our experiences. And it's also hard for us to deny that we don't view things through our stories. But as an aside, there's an idea out there today that's going counter some of the postmodern views that would almost be called like the tyranny of the subjective. In other words, if we all kind of are built in our own little echo chambers, then we really have no way to communicate outside of that. In other words, we can't transfer our experience to other people, so the only way for us to get what we might find just is to shout louder than somebody else. So you almost have to have like a tyranny of your own subjectivity on somebody else, because we can't figure out what's alike between us, what binds us together. I was thinking about this, and I full admit, I just learned today exactly what a hashtag was. I don't have Twitter or Snapchat. Is that the other one? How cool I am. I know all these things. But you think about how, because that was a pound sign when I was a kid, or the number sign, right? So these hashtags, whatever you place after them, that's some sort of keyword, you're basically calling out people that think like you. So I thought it'd be really cool, and if any of you do this, I want some money. Come up with like a logarithm or some sort of algorithm where you can do the opposite, right? So every time you put out something with your keywords, it actually gets people that are opposed to you and drags you into conversation. Wouldn't that be something different, right? So what we can keep in the back of our heads, we're starting to look through what she's saying here, is that we do build our own narratives, and in the very sense we are constructing our own identities. But that seems empowering on one side, doesn't it? Like I can be who I want to be, but it also doesn't really let me know, well, who am I? I mean, how do I determine who I am? And can I only be who I am now? And she's going to kind of say that, right? I might be putting words in her mouth on how she'd interpret other stuff, but it would be the fallout, what I would see through it, okay? So if you take the prince, I'm trying to stick with our prince and cobbler, right? She says, the way that memories are going to be important isn't that the memories themselves, as each one form our identity, because we already know that there's going to be some things that we remember and some things that we don't. We'll talk about that again shortly. But we all have past memories, whether they're conscious to our minds or not. And then we have our present self. And we don't know our future, but it's not entirely unknown either, right? I mean, there's certain things that we are predicting in the back of our minds. So you have a decent enough idea how the next 5 years might work. You might be wrong on some things, but I bet you're going to be right more so than wrong, okay? Because a lot of our memories that have formed our identities, have created a certain cycle that we don't just simply get out of, right? I mean, we don't just become another person tomorrow. So there's going to be some continuity. So what she's trying to get at is, the narrative. If we can understand continuity rather in terms of memories, this is her critique of Parfit, right, and Locke. Let's talk about the individual, you know, and that particular identity in terms of their own narrative. It's going to have to be subjective, and it's going to have to be constructed to a certain degree. But it's not entirely, it's not foreign to the, you know, to where we live. It's part of the culture and the environment we're in. Because you think about how many things are necessary for us to be who we were. Your country of origin, not just your country of origin, but where you live. Probably, certainly, socioeconomic status, right? I mean, I think for myself how my understandings of economics and poverty and justice were formed over the years. It had nothing to do with like growing up with very little, that was true. But I remember when I was in college, I was a bar manager. I worked 45 hours a week at this country club. It was a pretty ritzy country club. And I remember seeing the movers and shakers, and it wasn't the town I grew up in, but the movers and shakers, and I saw them in a light that was very upsetting to me, I would almost say. It was almost like, you know, it disturbed, let's put it this way, it disturbed my story, all right? I saw them almost as like a lot of like drinking habits that were not beneficial to them or to the people they were with. I saw, you know, almost, I felt like the help in Downton Abbey. They were having affairs in front of me, but I was the help, you know. So what does it matter if I see? And I thought, you know, I started thinking, wow, there's really nothing here, is it? I mean, you know, I think growing up, I thought, well, you know, if you had a certain amount of money, this would be possible, that's going to be possible. And then I saw kids getting mad with this, and I saw one family, I won't go into the personal stories, because I told this, the reason not, I told this personal story once, and somebody came up and they were actually related to this family, and I was like, holy crap, you know, you don't think that far away. But, you know, children suing the parents and the business and this and that, and, you know, and you start to see all that. So I think for me personally, it could be that I didn't have a good perception of it, right? That's not the point. If these memories are formed and our stories are formed by our perceptions. But it started to make me see that, you know, there's something hollow about that, and there's a higher inclination for an injustice. Now, there could be a lot of things that are good that are done with that, right, too. But I start to think of what formed me. So you think of what formed you, wherever you live, and whatever you did, and how you grew up, the race, the ethnicity, the socioeconomic status, depending on where you were at a given, you know, cultural moment. Was there something extraordinary that went on? I mean, how, like, okay, when I grew up, you're talking through the 70s and such, you know, with this whole idea of nuclear holocaust and, you know, and the arms race. Well, how could that not affect me? How could it not affect you worrying about, you know, certain things of terrorism or social media and how that, I mean, so we may not know the effects of these things. We just know that they're causing something, right? But they develop our story. So the reason why I bring all those up is that, you know, our future is not entirely independent of all of that. So I think she's on to something there. I like that idea. I always get a little concerned with the overly subjective. I think there's an element towards that because emotions, you know, are a lot of times drive our senses and our feeling. No, I don't mean like our sensory, but it drives our sense of things, and they're very difficult to manage, right? Emotions are very, how do you want to say, they're unreliable. They're easy to be hurted, and by hurted I mean you think of like presidential slogans, right? You can go back over the last 3 presidents we had. I mean, if you didn't know what the slogan was, I mean, if you didn't know it was attached to a candidate and somebody just told you the slogan, you know, hope or yes we can or let's make it great, I mean, nobody would disagree with those things. I mean, hope, well, I'm not for despair, you know. So what happens to do is if we have our own subjective views, we tend to almost adapt to whatever that slogan is. We make it fit our own subjectivity, and then what happens is we all kind of feel we're on the same plane because we all are behind that slogan, and we don't realize how distinct we are, right? So I like the idea that she puts forth about the narratives. I think there's something there because nobody can deny that our stories form who we are. I just don't know if I would hang my hat of identity on that. I don't know. Would anybody have any thoughts on that? It's an opinion, but you're welcome to have those.
My question would be like, how do you expect to experience life like in any other way other than your stories pretty much then? Like what's the alternative?
Well, that's true. That's true. Well, you're always going to experience it, but maybe we'd have to say that, you know, if that becomes like, you know, like at some point if somebody says, okay, here's an old thing that you remember. a lot of times people, I remember like when I was younger, they would always say, if somebody says, you know, who are you, don't tell them what you do for a living. Because that should be your identity. Now that's part of your narrative, but does it become your identity? So a lot of these experiences such, maybe what we're trying to get at, see, they're going to deny that there's any underlying reality. And by that I mean that there's any underlying nature to who we are. It's almost like as we're constructing it per se. At least that's the way I understand it. But your point's taken. I mean, this is your story. There's nothing else you can. Now, being aware of it and being self-reflective is a gain. Because then at least, you know, you can, you know, value that and judge it against whatever it is that you've heard. You know, it's almost like, you know, I even think like the end I grew up in with the ethnic groups that were there, as important as they were, because that was part of the identity, you wouldn't want to use that as the sole filter for everything, because then it becomes very narrow. But anybody else have anything on that? Just curious. So if you were to say to her, well, then who is the self? Who am I? It's what your story is. What is your narrative, right? Now, again, I think there's something to this. There's something that doesn't still ring true for me. It's in a sense that I think that this is important, but I don't know that I walk around with this collection. Well, let's see if I have it here. In other words, it comes down to not even narrative, it's the characteristics, right? So everything from, you know, agency, experiences, desires, all these things that are particular to us, you know, I don't know that I necessarily think of all those things. And I'd even struggle, like if somebody were to ask me, like, what is it that you do? You know, that's an interesting question to ask somebody. We're almost going to initially say it, like you would probably say a student, you know, and say, oh, I'm a prof, but, you know, but that's not real. I mean, you know, you're a temporary student, and this isn't all I do, so you don't know how to exactly do that either. And maybe there's something primary there. I'm not quite sure. It gets a little hard here to figure out exactly what it is, but my point is, you know, if you've gotten like a little bad taste in your mouth from these, you know, elaborate proofs and elaborate thought experiments, it's almost like you have to go that way. Once you go into a materialistic reduction view of the human person, in other words, there can't be some underlying reality or nature. It doesn't have to be a Platonic form. It doesn't even have to be like, you know, something that like as an absolute essential nature. It could be other understandings of it too. We don't have time to go into, like I'm thinking of like Duns Scotus and such that had other ideas for what makes our individuation, what makes us us. But you're going to have to strive for something, which is why they're all doing this. You know, this is a materialistic reductionist view. So, you know, from a strict empirist point of view, well, what else do you do? You know, you're going to need something. If I think it's this, well, then we're going to have to build that out as a theory. Well, how do I falsify my theory? Well, I'm going to have to do it by using some sort of elaborate thought experiment. And if the thought experiment undoes it, well, then it's no longer a valid theory, and we have to readjust our theory. So you can almost see like the falsification, like Karl Popper's falsification going at work here, and maybe in a way that it shouldn't be applied. In other words, if you got a hold of somebody who didn't accept the premises here, in other words, if we were able to bring Socrates here, he'd probably thinking, what are you talking about? You know, I mean, it would be such a foreign object to the whole thing. It wouldn't be like he'd be dismissive of the whole thing. He'd say you'd have to accept certain premises before you even start down this road. You know, so I think it's interesting to read about these people and such, and perhaps it rings true for you. That's perfectly fine. It's part of the argument. But it's almost like if she had a difficult time arguing against Parfit, it's because she stayed on the same field, you know. And maybe we'd like that. It's like you're trying to change the argument. It's like, well, no, I never framed the argument like that to begin with. I can't get drug into the discussion in the way that you want me to. I don't accept that. It would almost be like an atheist having some sort of argument about proofs of God and such. They could do it theoretically, but they're not going to be drug into the argument where they're going to accept the premise. So it's going to be a different discussion. It's the same way here, too. You know, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot of good stuff that we can get here. Now, here's something that, you know, we already kind of hinted on, is that, you know, we spill something on ourselves, hot or cold or such, we have an instinctual reaction to it. Now, we can recognize the cause, we know exactly what happened. But psychologically, can you think of things that maybe a person would do as a reaction to it, but they don't know why? In other words, they have a response to some stimulant, and they don't know why. You guys aren't old enough to be nostalgic yet. Good for you, right? Are you?
We all are.
Well, I guess you are, but maybe that's right. Maybe I'm dismissing this because I think about some of the stuff I see even like my kids post on TV, like they miss Lizzie McGuire, I never watch or anything. When you get older and you start, whatever TV shows you like now are going to wind up on the upper channels in 20 years, and whatever songs you like now are going to eventually be played in elevators, and you'll start to see like these Times collection, that here's the songs from the 70s. Well, the minute you start listening, so maybe this is where I'm wrong. You're right. You hear a song, right? You don't ever just really hear that song. I mean, there's a lot of things that get wrapped up in that. What was going on in your life at the time? Maybe it was a more comfortable time. I think that's what Christmas music does for people, right? I mean, it almost puts you into that mode. Or there was a Geico commercial a while back. It had a drill sergeant listening to as a therapist, and there was a guy on the couch saying, that's why I think yellow makes me sad. Well, why? Who knows? I mean, who knows what these experiences are? And it's like somehow we don't quite grasp the fall. Maybe like you have a very what do you want to say? Almost medieval setting with some of the buildings, the falls and the trees. You watch enough Harry Potter, it can probably bring that into your mind when you see things. So there's a lot of stimuli that we have to certain things, and we're not quite sure where all this comes from. That's going to be, I think, I'm not sure what she would say about that. I'm not a scholar on her. But those are not going to be conscious memories. We could talk more about that. Okay. So what she thought about, Parfit and Locke was, they're relying too much on these conscious memories. So, I was fortunate to grow up in a time where people didn't really lock their doors so much, and even as a young kid, you can go away for 7 or 8 hours, and your mom had no idea where you were. And I lived in town, but if I walked about 2 miles out of town, I can get some pretty cool places, right? And I did it all the time, like 10, 11 years old. I mean, I literally remember. I know it's gonna sound stupid, but I loved Solitude. And it wasn't like my neighborhood was busy. There was a lot of families, a lot of kids. But I was the Bambino, so my one brother home, my other sister was in college, my other one was already married. So it wasn't like there was a lot of noise right in the house, but it was a small house, right? I mean, you just have a kitchen, and we had a kitchen and a TV room. And then we had a parlor, which was a small room nobody went into. I don't know what the hell that was about, We weren't allowed to walk on it. My dad said, you're going to ruin the road, okay, I won't go in there, So I think he wanted to get out of the house because there was no place there. It's like the days I told my kids, I said, boy, you get sent to your room, it's like a pleasure. I mean, there's more crap in there. I mean, I got sent to my room. There was a picture of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and there was, a radio, and that was about it. And you just sat there, and there's nothing to do. So you get out, right? So I remember I loved, and I know it's going to sound corny, but I loved to sit underneath like bridges, like these little tiny like stone bridges that go over creeks and stuff. And I would sit there sometimes for 3 or 4 hours. And I would like watch the water, and I'd try to predict where the water's going to go and try to figure out if there's some kind of pattern there. I love looking at masonry and how that whole thing works. And I just hung out. And I only had 2 books. It's the funniest thing in the world that, my dad had never graduated high school, didn't like reading, and didn't even really care for me to read because he says they're storybooks. What are you reading that for? They're storybooks. It's made up, that kind of thing. We only had 2 books in the house, and boy, was I fortunate. We had Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, and we had Milton's Paradise Lost. I don't know where they came from. I still have them, So it's like I just dug into those. Oh, we had one Shirley Jackson. It was old. Do you guys ever remember the story, The Lottery? Has anybody read The Lottery? It's a short story. You got to read it. It's pretty cool. I mean, I don't even want to tell you about it because it'll give it away.
Wait, is that the stone one?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I read that.
Okay, that's Shirley Jackson. Yeah. Okay, so we had one of those. So I would just sit there. Now, those are very conscious memories. I mean, I could almost put myself back into there. I don't know that I can say that that's formed my identity. I might be able to make the argument that whatever was, precipitating in me that would drive me there has stayed. But but that seems like a pretty trivial conscious memory. And it's funny, the older you get, the harder this stuff gets too. My mother, does anybody have TV trays at their house? Isn't that something? We weren't allowed to eat in front of the TV, but a TV tray was these little folding things, and you literally sat in the chair and you put it there and you could eat it while you watched TV. I mean, it was exactly what it said. We had a couple, but my mom only used them at Christmas time to put like cookies out. So she'd make, the cavalajuns or something, and she put out these cookies. And I remember I couldn't wait for that. I have memories of, there was not the instant pudding, so she had to make the pudding like on the stove. And if you ever scalded milk, anybody ever like try to make your own cocoa or something? It's disgusting. It's got like a film on top. You're picking up this milk skin. But I remember that distaste for that. I almost had to forget that as she was making the pudding. And then I remember she'd put cellophane over the, whatever she made, the pudding, so that the refrigerator didn't make it like hard or rubbery, but we weren't allowed to eat it until it cooled. And I remember she'd yell at me, shut the refrigerator, because I'd open the fridge and I'd shake it to see if the friggin' things are solid yet so I can eat or something like that. So, I mean, you could probably think of how many memories you have like that. So I don't know, like, what do you think, how would that play into our personal identity? What do you think? Or whatever yours are, right? What do you think? Do you think they would? Do you think they could? Maybe subconsciously? I don't know.
What do you mean by they? Like
Those
conscious
memories. Yeah, these conscious memories. So like you could probably think of how many memories you have, of things that, who knows, siblings did, uncles did, or whatever. And it's, if they're not important, like you said, if they're not important, then what is the place for these memories? I don't know. I couldn't read everything I read about her. I couldn't see her differentiating between, what was crucial and what might have been slightly trivial. Maybe it was implicit that these things wouldn't be there, right? But nonetheless, how about the other way? She also critiqued the other place that now again, this is her critique of them, right? Maybe they're downplaying the unconscious memories. Does anybody have an unconscious memory that you are now conscious of, but for the longest time you had no clue? Anybody have an experience? Come on, people pay for this kind of therapy. Anybody watch Everybody Loves Raymond? Do we know what Everybody Loves Raymond is? Do we know the characters, right? Robert and Ray. You don't watch that film?
I have no idea.
Carlos, that has to be part of your education at Villanova. You got to take a Raymond class, okay? So, real quick, Raymond's the favorite son of Marie Barone, and Robert's the older brother who everything, nothing's about him. So, if anybody knows, there's like a little, what do you want to call it? A little habit he has that when he eats food, he always touches the food to his chin right before he eats it. Just does it all the time. And of course, they make fun of him. It's like, what are you, like a weirdo? What do you keep doing that for? But he can't stop it. It's an unconscious. I mean, if you say, why are you doing that? No recollection. Now, my point is there's something there that I would say is pretty central to an identity. I mean, it's not like just like a little, twitch. It's every single time he eats. If he gets a piece of pizza, touches his chin, then he puts it in his food. If he's eating soup, touches his chin, and then puts it in his mouth, that kind of thing. Well, Raymond's wife was taking a psychology class, so she wanted to put her Freudian analysis to work. So she starts to get a little story. So anyway, Marie's sitting, now they're adults, so you have the grandmother, Marie, whatever, sitting next to Raymond, who's in his 40s, and Marie starts saying, oh, you were so cute when you were little, you were cuter than that that Gerber baby, you were the sweetest little thing. And then she almost starts playing, like regressing back. She takes some food and goes, here comes the plane, this and that. And he's like, will you stop it, Mom? Well, finally, he caves in and she puts the food in his mouth. And then she takes the food down on his chin and says, well, we don't want to lose any of that. And scrapes his chin and puts it back in his mouth. Well, the wife is over there and she's like, hold on. where was Robert when you were doing this? He was sitting, first of all, she goes, well, I don't know, because he told her he feels like he's nothing. But he was sitting in her hair watching the whole thing. So she goes, that's it. He touches the food to his mouth because he was self-soothing, because that's what you used to do for him, and now you only do it for Raymond, and that's his way of making himself get attention from you that you're not giving to him. Well, okay, you can imagine what Robert felt after all that. But now there's what I would say an unconscious memory that it's formed a habit in his life. That's pretty essential, and there's probably a lot of things that we do, if we really wanted to be self-analytical, there's probably a lot of stuff that we do that have formed habits over the years, and we're not quite sure why we do it, right? What do you think of that? These things are problems, right? With Parfit is what she's trying to say. He's underplaying the subconscious memories and underplaying the subconscious, overplaying the conscious, And that's why I didn't get any impression that she was talking about more essential and less important memories. It seemed like you wouldn't make this argument. You'd have to make it apparent. We're only talking about memories that are closer to a person's identity. I didn't get any of that from her, okay? So in the end, it's these narratives and these characteristics, obviously, that she's going to say are much more central. And it's those experiences, desires, agency. I didn't play the angle on this, but agency is, obviously our free will. And she really plays off of this into that. So, she was a bioethicist, or is a bioethicist also, right? So this all plays into who the human person is. It's one of those things, and this is why we're going to run a recap on Monday. You can't really form an ethic, even a personal ethic, until you have some concept of the human person. Unfortunately, we skate over that, right? It's like I was teaching this one course on social justice, and Martin Luther King Jr., when he was absolutely nonviolent in his approaches to social injustices, and if you wanted to be part of his group, you almost had to attend his seminars. And the seminars had like a step-by-step, almost like thing, like you have to say this, right? Like, in other words, are you willing to take blows without returning them? Are you willing to do this? And if you weren't, then he didn't even want us interested. But he said, when you see an injustice, like something unethical happening, he said the very first thing you have to do is identify it. What is this injustice that we're up against? He said, then the next thing you know is to negotiate. Start and having a conversation and seeing if you can't do something to alleviate this injustice, and then after that, then you move to action. But, we've kind of jumped those first two. I mean, we're not reflective of so much. Something bad's going here, especially if it turns into be like a hashtag justice thing. Everybody jumps on board. No, negotiate, stop what you're doing, we're going to shut you down. And we're all really going to the other thing. So, even that is based, his understanding of the human person was much more, Thomistic and Aristotelian. So if you're going to place dignity on the human person, you need to find a way to do that. Like, if we're going to ask ourselves, why should we be nice to somebody? That seems like it's an easy answer, and it seems like, well, everybody knows why you should be nice to somebody. You can imagine you just entered a dialogue, you might as well be, Euthyphro talking to Socrates. He's going to twist you around. Before you know it, you're going to I don't really know why I should be nice to somebody. But yet you think you do. And it has to be an understanding of who this person is. Well, so I think, these narratives and characteristics play into that. I'm not quite sure that she's nailed it for me. And then what she says is not important, right, is, when you tried to go from like the prince and the cobbler, right, the idea is that whatever that identity was had to be numerically one. So that numerically one identity that was in the prince had to be the numerically one identity in the cobbler. She's like, no, that's not. We're not worrying about that. Okay, that's not even essential to what we're saying. We're much more into this. We're not even into the psychological continuity. We're talking more about a narrative that is based on the subjective views of many things, but it's the characteristics and the experiences and all those things, right? So it's not the numerical oneness, nor is it just simply the continuity. You have a story to tell as this thing moves on, and in the end, the only thing that matters is it's a narrative that connects all these memories. So she's going to agree with Parfit on the role of memories. She's just going to critique him, saying that he underplays, the subconscious memories, and he overplays the conscious memories. but the memories are still important. It's these past memories that are going to have some bearing on who we are and in our present life, and our future, we're not predicting it, but it's not entirely wide open either. I mean, you can't be anything, right? So we formed ourselves in our past memories, and those are going to continue on, and this narrative then, these characteristics that are built through our narrative, that's the self. So if you were to describe, I am this, you would have to come up with some sort of sound of that. So she goes, that's the prince. We're not worried about what's the interior continuity, the numerical oneness. So, does that sound right? Do you have any questions or anything on that?